Good evening to everybody, and welcome to the Lewis Masterclass Intersection. Today, we're going to be discussing a very interesting intersection with a high-profile speaker. I want to remind everybody that the reason why we have labeled these masterclasses as intersection is because we believe that the challenges that we're going to be facing now and in the future are particularly complicated and complex, or even more complex, so that they require the development of bridges, of links across discipline, perspectives, and in fact, viewpoints. I'm Andrea Prencipe, I'm the Rector of Lewis University, and I'm going to be the host of today's masterclass. Today we're going to be exploring a very interesting and new intersection, the one between entrepreneurship and democracy. And we've invited a very illustrious speaker from the United States of America, Professor Rebecca Henderson from Harvard University. Good evening, Rebecca.
Good evening, Andrea. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Just let me give you a brief, really brief and short overview of Rebecca's academic and policy-making activity. As I mentioned, she's a professor at Harvard University, and in fact, she holds the John and Natty McArthur University Professorship at Harvard University, and she's the one of the 25 professors at Harvard University. She comes from a technical background. She holds a mechanical engineering degree from MIT, and then she went on to study economics for her PhD at Harvard University. And she has been exploring and studying firms across sectors, across industrial sectors, and also she's been studying issues which are somehow cross-cutting different themes and issues. So she has been basically developing a very interesting understanding of how firms' dynamics actually takes place. And I would like to say, underline the fact that Rebecca would somehow perfectly fit the idea that we have in Lewis of research in social sciences. In Lewis, we say that we would like to produce actionable social sciences. And this is what Rebecca has been doing, because she's always been able to develop implications for practice, for practice management, but also for policy makers. We're going to be relying upon Rebecca's latest publication, which is going to be, again, touching upon the issue of entrepreneurship and democracy. Rebecca's just published a book whose title is Reimagining Capitalism in the World of Fire, and Lewis University Press has just published the Italian translation, which is, here it is, whose title is Nel mondo che brucia, ripensiamo il capitalismo per la sopravvivenza del pianeta. Before giving the floor to Rebecca, I also told her that I'd like to remind just one thing. Rebecca's work has been an important source of inspiration for my work as a researcher. Her paper with Kim Clark in IASQ, Administrative Science Quarterly, back in 1990, Architectural Innovation, the reconfiguration of existing product technologies and the failure of established firms, was in fact the source of inspiration for my own research. And in fact, a paper which I published back in 2001, whose title was Why Do Firms Know More Than They Make?, which was actually reflecting upon the groundbreaking idea of Rebecca and Kim on architectural innovation. Without further ado, I'll now leave the floor to Rebecca Henderson so that she can illustrate the key issue, the key elements of her book, Reimagining Capitalism. Please, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Andrea, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you even more for publishing my book in Italian. My mother was raised in Italy, so I grew up visiting the country and eating Italian food, and it's in many ways my second home. So I'm honored and delighted there should be an Italian edition. I'm also so excited that my work should have made some difference to your own very eminent research career. So thank you very much for mentioning it. Reimagining Capitalism, or Entrepreneurship and Democracy. how do we think about the very big issues of our time and the role of business in addressing some of the enormous problems that we face? My experience has been that many people think capitalism is no longer working for them. We see wages stagnant in many parts of the world. We see problems of exclusion as historically marginalized groups fall further behind, particularly during the pandemic. And we see a failure to deal with the enormous environmental problems we face, noticeably climate change. More than half of the world's population, according to one Edelman survey, say capitalism is not working for them. And if you ask young Americans whether they prefer capitalism to socialism, more than half say socialism. They probably mean they want a decent healthcare system, but still, all the signs point to real concerns about the role of business in our society, ultimately threatening its legitimacy in what I believe to be a very dangerous way. Because some people are responding to these pressures by saying, why reimagine capitalism? Why don't we just get rid of it? Why don't we find another system? In my view, that would be a huge mistake. I think capitalism is one of the great inventions of the human race, an unparalleled source of prosperity and opportunity and individual freedom. But we clearly have issues. Something is not working. Many people have many explanations, of course, but my own belief is the reason we need to reimagine capitalism is because it has fallen out of balance. I think that the work in political economy, development economics, and in history and political science suggests very strongly that strong, free, prosperous societies rest on three foundations. Yes, on the free market, an unparalleled source of growth and efficiency. We need the jobs, we need the innovation the free market can provide. I don't think we'll solve the problems we face without it. But the free market has to be balanced by a democratically accountable, transparent, capable government and a strong civil society. The free market with no constraints is hugely dangerous. That's most obviously in the case of climate change. If you allow people to burn fossil fuels for free, they will do so, causing immense damage both to the people who live next to the coal-fired power station and to our descendants as they have to grapple with the reality of climate change. $10 worth of coal-fired electricity, for example, will power your cell phone for about 10 years. That sounds like a pretty good deal. But the real cost of generating $10 worth of coal-fired electricity is not $10, but something more like 26. Every time coal is burned, we throw off lead and mercury and fine particulates, which cause immense amounts of health damage. And we also generate carbon dioxide, which plays into climate change. So the real costs of $10 worth of coal-fired electricity is something more like $26. And that's a conservative estimate. And I've been cross-examining my friends in the School of Public Health and the Department of Economics, and they actually think the real cost of burning coal is probably much more. Now, when externalities like coal-fired pollution are not properly priced, a market is no longer free and fair. We have an economic system which is systematically destroying the stability of the planet. Similarly, if there isn't effective labor legislation, if it's okay to push wages to the very bottom so that people can be working full-time and yet still not be making a living wage, then I at least don't think capitalism is working. If people are denied opportunities because of where they happen to be born, because of the color of the skin or their accent, then the market is not truly free and doesn't generate real opportunity. If firms can set the rules of the game in their own favor, if they can influence the political process so we no longer have a democracy of people, but a democracy of money, that to me is not free or fair at all. So if that's the problem, if we've allowed the capitalist system, if we've allowed markets to become too strong, what is the solution? Well, the easy solution is a massive political and cultural and social movement to constrain the free market, to make sure that we have appropriate climate change regulation, to make sure that we have the education and healthcare systems that enable everyone to participate in the economic system and everyone to thrive, a campaign finance legislation and support for democracy, a free media that can make sure that you know that old phrase, he who has the money makes the rules. We have to make that not true. So to banish corruption and have a genuine democracy. So all we need is the politics to put that in place. Well, you're saying, well, if that's the case, why are we talking about entrepreneurship? Why are we talking about business? In England, the subtitle of my book is How Business Can Save the World. Why should we think that people like you and me can make a difference against these problems? So, my book is 288 pages, and it's an answer to this question. Let me see if I can capture it for you in a few minutes. The first issue is this. There is a very strong collective business case for addressing these problems. It's going to be difficult to make money in a world in which the great coastal cities are underwater and millions of angry people are migrating north because droughts and floods have meant that the harvests are failing. It's going to be tough to indulge in private enterprise if most people think that the rich and the powerful are trashing the planet for their own benefit. It's going to be hard to make money in a world in which the rage and anger at the problems we face is creating populist governments that are liable to do who knows what. But historically, both left-wing and right-wing populism has been deeply hostile to genuinely free markets and has led, quickly or slowly, to crony capitalism and deep corruption. So I believe if we care about the free market, if we care about capitalism, we as business people should be doing something about this. Well, you could say, all right, Rebecca, maybe there's a collective problem, but I have to make payroll. I have to run a business. I can't deal with these huge problems. But yes, you can. In the first place, solving these problems is already creating enormous economic opportunity. My friend Michael Porter calls it shared value, the opportunity to make money and address major public problems at the same time. At HBS, we have written more than 300 cases on firms that are making money by addressing tough problems at billion-dollar scale. You've heard of Tesla, of course, and how Elon Musk has made himself one of the richest people on the planet by moving aggressively to introduce electrical vehicles. But there are hundreds and thousands of firms trying to develop solutions for climate change, developing renewable energy, finding ways to make meat that isn't meat and doesn't rely on beef cattle and the emissions they generate. That is finding opportunities to retrofit buildings so they use less energy. That is finding that when you treat people with dignity and respect, you can not only raise wages, but increase your own profits. So we know there are business models that will enable firms to make a difference against these problems. That's the first step. The The second step is to start to build cooperation between firms, because many of these firms present a collective problem to a collective problem. But if all the firms in an industry join together, then they can be solved. And then, just to summarize them, we need to rewire finance. We need to completely rethink accounting measures and how we allocate capital so that we address these problems, which are existential threats to the long-term stability of our financial markets as well as our economy. And last but not least, we need to engage with government. Business needs to step up and say, we need democratically accountable, transparent, capable government. You need to hold us to account. That sounds terribly general, I know. The book is filled with stories of how this is actually happening. And let me tell you one, to give you some intuition of what this looks like on the ground, so it doesn't feel like some grand theory. This is the lived reality of tens of thousands of business people. Let me tell you about Eric Osmundson, who left a cushy career in private equity to become the CEO of a garbage company, a trash company. This was not a typical career move, but Eric wanted to make a difference in the world. And he knew that changing the way we handle our trash could reduce global carbon dioxide emissions by hundreds of millions of tons. On the very first month on the job, he discovered that the entire industry was deeply corrupt, that both the firm he was running and his competitors were dumping garbage illegally or mislabeling it and shipping it to less developed countries. He decided to go public with what he had found and to announce that his company, Norsk Gjenvinning, would run a clean operation focused on recycling. Half of the members of his senior team quit. So did nearly half of his customers, because he announced he was going to raise prices to cover the costs of doing the right thing. His competitors sued him for bringing the industry into disrepute. It was not a good moment. But when you try to do something, people get excited. Those employees who remained were delighted that they might be part of an organization that was going to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Many of his customers stepped up. They feared the reputational damage that they might suffer if it was discovered how their garbage was being handled. His investors stood behind him 100%, believing that taking a hit now could build a much stronger business model for the future. He was able to persuade many of his competitors to commit to doing the same thing, on the grounds that if no one dumped trash illegally, no one would have to compete with a firm whose prices were artificially low. And he started working with government to change the rules and regulations, which were being very poorly enforced and which had very low fines, to try and create the regulatory regime he needed to build a thriving business that didn't dump waste illegally. And I won't tell you that everything's amazing and Eric is perfect, but he has built one of the largest trash handling companies in Scandinavia. And he is one of the top 10 most desirable places to work in Norway. What he has found is that when you turn away from just dumping the trash and instead start to think about solving the problem, that you can build a recycling business that has very significant economies of scale, that is a major source of competitive advantage, and that enables him to basically dominate his industry. So he was able to use a problem to reshape his firm and to reshape the entire structure of the industry in order to address a fundamental problem. He would be the first to tell you that he's no hero, that he had amazing people working with him in his teams. I have met so many business people like Eric. It is possible to make a significant difference in the world and to really change where we're going. More and more firms with which I work are standing up here in the US and saying, the election was free and fair. The last president lost, and we are committed to building a strong political system which can be a partner to our business, to our strong economic system. So that's the story. That's the overview of the book. It's a big agenda, but I think it's really important.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks very much. You have offered a very interesting perspective on how to, first why, and how to rethink or reimagine capitalism. The first concept I've written down while you were speaking at the beginning was capitalism has been an important source of prosperity around the world, but now has gone out of balance. So we need to have some kind of constraint. And then you started introducing very interesting concepts such as the importance of civil society, the importance of keeping democracy of people, but not democracy of money. And then you have provided some kind of how-to's solution to redefine, recreate the basis for a new capitalism. And the first was new business models. So we need to start off, as your research has been telling us in the last few years, from the inside of the capitalism system to revisit the actual system, the system itself. And then also you mentioned the importance of developing cooperation amongst firms, but also between firms and other actors of the capitalism systems. You mentioned engagement with government, which is as much as important as the cooperation amongst firms, but also, which also struck me, was the importance of developing new accounting system to make firms and in general actors accountable for what they do. And then the case study that you have illustrated is really very telling in this respect. So it does say that there are opportunities to do, say, business in a different way, but still under the large umbrella of the capitalism system. So now my question is you mentioned that your book is filled with case studies. How far we can go in this respect? So really, can we capture the attention of businesses around the world and convert them into this new way of thinking or rethinking capitalism? Because, by the way, I was actually reading an Italian newspaper this morning, the Corriere della Sera Economia, and I was surprised to see that investments, investment funds, who actually invest in those companies who are very keen on ESG objectives, for instance, are those who are making the most money, which is a good sign. So let me revert the question to you. Can we really go and attract the attention of, surely firms, but also governments, I think, which are as much important in this respect?
Andrea, it's a fantastic question. I'd love to answer it. I've accidentally shut my cat in the study with me. So here she is. And she is squeaking enormously. So I'm going to put her outside and then I will answer your question. I am sorry about that. She hides away in a corner and I shut the door. So, can we imagine the world really doing this? hundreds of thousands of business and business leaders embracing the need to make a difference against these problems and government joining them in doing that? Absolutely we can. It is already happening. In the first place, the problems we face are not secrets. We, as you may know, we had a major disaster in Texas in the last few days, where millions of people were without power, where water systems have been overwhelmed. Last summer, we saw major fires in California and in Australia, and huge flooding in Bangkok and Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, a third of the country was underwater. Climate change is very real. It's here and it's now. And more people are coming to see that it presents a real risk to the stability of the whole system. So we see in particular the owners of very large pools of capital and the managers of very large pools of capital coming to understand that if we don't address problems like social inclusion and climate change, the long-term returns to their portfolio will be threatened. The ex-governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, says that climate change is the largest financial threat to long-term financial returns. The chief investment officer of the GPIF, the Japanese government pension fund, a man called Hiro Mizuno, came to believe that the single biggest driver of long-term returns to his pensioners, to the people of Japan, was his ability to try and control climate change and increase social inclusion. So there's a general understanding that these problems are enormous and they're out there and we have to deal with them. And that's coupled with the increasing realization that, as I said, dealing with these problems is a great way to make money. As you said, data from the last 6 months to a year suggests that those firms that are explicitly focusing on environmental, social, and governance metrics, E, S, and G, have outperformed the broader market. You know, it's a little too early to know if that result is really true, and it might be overly influenced by the fact that the very big tech firms like Alphabet and Facebook have done very well and also tend to perform very well on these kinds of metrics. But we know from detailed studies in many industries that firms that take these problems seriously, that move to respond to new consumer demand, consumers are increasingly asking that firms pay attention to these issues, who have the kinds of employees that demand that their firms move in this direction, are seeing significantly higher levels of productivity and innovation. Most firms can't charge more for sustainable products, but we are seeing a consumer willingness to shift. So if consumers think it's the same product as a competitive product, but if they buy you, then they get these additional social benefits, they will buy your product. We're increasingly seeing that. And, you know, my personal metric, Andrea, is the talks I give. You know, 18 months ago, when I was talking to groups of executives, I'd say, well, climate change is a real problem and business has to move. And everyone would sort of sit back like this, you know, like, maybe somebody else. Now, when I say business must make a difference, people go, oh, yes, of course. How? It's a very different conversation. I'm getting calls from companies asking me to come and talk to their board of directors, to explain why these issues are so important, to talk to their employees about how the firm is engaging with these kinds of issues. This is becoming mainstream. And can governments play a role? Of course. The conditions vary so widely across the world. I hate to generalize, but in many places, governments are reaching out to business to try and form real partnerships to address issues like deforestation, like inequality, like social inclusion.
Let me just try to
further discussion on which actually comes from using our own research. I mean, research coming from innovation studies. Professor Henderson is an innovation scholar, and when we were actually I contacted Rebecca about this masterclass. She said, "Well, of course, I'm an innovation scholar, but the next frontier is sustainability at large." And one of the key results from innovation studies has a lot to do with the resistance to change, because what you are advocating for is a huge change, because it does impact the way we do business. It does impact the way we do policy making. It does impact, as you mentioned, also consumer behavior. Do you think that we can really press on these changes, say, without having a lot too many people resisting to it? Because we shouldn't forget that we human beings, we like routines, and we're very much keen on what worked in the past, and we don't know what's happening in the future. What's your take, looking at the cases that you have been dealing with?
As you know, I was the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management at MIT for many years. Eastman Kodak was once the most successful firm in the world by some measures. People used to say of it, there is nothing more profitable that is legal. It was an incredibly successful firm, and they were totally unable to respond to the switch to digital cameras. I was the Eastman Kodak professor. That was a coincidence, but that was what my research was about. I don't know if anyone listening or watching is familiar with Nokia, the Finnish telecommunications company. I worked with Nokia. I spent 6 months in Finland trying to persuade Nokia that Apple was a serious threat to their core business. As you probably know, totally without success. And I've never forgotten a key moment in working with Nokia when I was in a conference room with their chief strategy officer and their chief operating officer. And I had showed them a slide deck of what I thought was going to happen to them if they did not respond. And, I don't think I was particularly prescient. I was just playing out the trends, but I was right. And I remember the two men looked at me and they said, "Rebecca, we think you're probably right, but we cannot respond. We can't do what you suggest. It's too radical. It's too expensive. It's too counter to our culture." And so, of course, I have moments when I think, we're never going to respond. Kodak couldn't respond. Nokia couldn't respond. Why will we as a world respond? It's easy to be a little despairing and a little hopeless. The world is immensely complicated, and we are moving far too slowly. But there's no good in despair, and no real reason for it. One of the things I learned studying firms that changed is the secret weapon that really helps firms change is purpose, is commitment to doing something more than simply making money, is an emotional commitment to change because it will make a difference to customers or the societies in which the firm is located or to the local community, or because the technology will be fun. But some sense of purpose, some sense of connection to something greater than yourselves, that's what helps firms change. Now, you have to have the strategy right. You have to have a good business case. You need to think through the organizational issues. As you know, I spent many years of my academic career trying to flesh out what is required to make firms change. But at root is a common commitment to making a difference in the world and to facing the difficulty that comes with change. And we have that. We have that secret weapon because the world is burning. I called my book Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And sometimes people say, "Oh, Rebecca, how did you know? You wrote that book, 18 months ago." I say, well, it wasn't very difficult. There were these huge flashing lights everywhere. that we were in trouble. And I think, everybody can see them. So employees are pushing really hard. Customers are increasingly pushing. As societies, we will increasingly push. We will say, you have to fix this. You have to do something. And that pressure is what will enable us to change.
Thanks, Rebecca. This idea of the sense of purpose does convince me. And also the idea of commitment to change does resonate, not only because I'm an innovation scholar, but in general, because I think that's the direction that we're going to be taking. So questions have started flocking. Let me just start asking you questions. The first one is from Jose, who asks, even Bill Gates, a former fierce enemy of public intervention in the economy, is now advocating some to fight climate change. Is this the end of the invisible hand?
Friedrich Hayek, one of Milton Friedman's closest friends and one of the more right-wing economists of the last 100 years, was a strong advocate for what he called the pricing of externalities. Government intervention to make sure that when we use something and sell it, prices reflect real costs. That's not an anti-invisible hand idea. That's the idea that the invisible hand always needed, guardrails. You needed to make sure free markets have always required governments to function. They've always required a government to enforce contracts, to make sure that when people make representations, those are true, to make sure that people don't act illegally to generate profits. So it's not goodbye to the invisible hand. It's hello to, you need both hands, one visible and one invisible, to make the free market work. And without climate regulation, we do not have a free market, and we do have a badly stricken planet. Bill Gates is not the only one. Thousands of business people have joined together with mayors and local governments and city governments and politicians in movements like We Are Still In to push for climate regulation. To say, look, to do our job, we need a price on climate. If you're an entrepreneur trying to solve climate change and you're competing with someone who can burn fossil fuels and dump greenhouse gas pollutions on the rest of us without paying for it, you are starting the race with weights on your feet. If coal-fired electricity was really priced at $26 instead of $10, then trying to sell solar panels or wind would be so much easier. Now, in many parts of the world, because we've had amazing technological progress, renewables are already cheaper than fossil fuels. But there's still many places where being able to use fossil fuels for free is causing all kinds of market distortions. That's what needs to be fixed. We're not moving away from the free market. We're putting the conditions in place to make sure that it does what it needs to do and serves us, not short-term profit at any cost.
Very interesting, Rector, this idea of having both hands, both visible and invisible, and the visible one is to put some kind of constraints in and around the visible hands in order to produce what we may call kind of collective wellness or goodness. Let me go to another question, which is very interesting. It does resonate to the fact that, as you probably know, Italy's industrial structure is very much composed by SMEs. And so Nicola asks whether these kind of ideas can be somehow applied or applicable in an environment where there are way too many SMEs, which, as we all know, do have the issues of somehow creating connection amongst them or creating connection between them and the government. So how do you see SMEs in this new arena?
I think SMEs can play a very powerful role and can benefit themselves immensely by focusing on these questions. It varies hugely from industry to industry, but in many industries, small firms are best positioned to pioneer, to discover new business models, to remake supply chains so that they create less waste, and so that they and to reach customers in new ways, to create brands that stand for sustainability and doing the right thing. Small firms are particularly well positioned to treat the people they employ in better ways. It's much easier to build a high commitment work system where your purpose is shared deeply with the people that work for you, and where the firm as a whole feels together committed to the mission. That's much easier to do if you're a small firm. And my understanding, and again, you know so much more about the Italian industrial landscape than I do, but my understanding is that historically, Italian SMEs have found very effective ways to work together to address common problems. So to the degree that that's an important part of the solution, to the degree that you need several firms to agree to do things in a different way, Italy has, I believe, a deep history on which surely some firms can draw.
Thanks, Rebecca. This is very, very interesting. And this is also an interesting approach and perspective that surely will, our SMEs and the policymakers will adopt. We are coming to the end of this very interesting masterclass, and I have another question, which somehow preempts my own question, which I was going to ask you at the end, because it does focus on whether or not there are specific entrepreneurial skills and attitudes that would provide the benefit for society for sustainability issues. I mean, do we need to rethink also education in order to address climate change issues and the likes?
We need business leaders who are not only superbly trained in the conventional skills of business. So everything you're teaching at Luis right now, absolutely, we need to keep. I tell my students, if you're going to do this, you need to be a superb business person. But you also need to have a wider vision. The root of the problems we face is that we have focused too much on right now and the individual. It's been about me right now. And if we're going to move forward successfully, we have to learn to focus on us and later. And you can run a firm that focuses on the long term and that is devoted to solving public problems profitably, to use the word of Colin Mayer at Oxford, which is a formulation I love. Firms are machines for solving public problems profitably. Great jobs, good food, wonderful houses, but without creating all the side effects that we've been living with. That takes vision. That takes commitment to the longer term. That takes, and I don't know if you teach this, it often takes being emotionally available, being connected to the people you work with, having it not be just about you, but about the people you work with and the customers you serve. Now, I believe that's always been good business, but I think now more than ever, not only having great strategy skills, understanding marketing, really being a whiz at finance, those all remain incredibly important, but they need to be linked with this broader perspective. I had the great pleasure of running the strategic retreats for Mr. Paul Polman, who until recently was the CEO of Unilever when he first became CEO. And so I got to see him in action. And one of the things that was striking about him is he could move seamlessly from giving a passionate talk about the ways in which Unilever could make a difference in the lives of hundreds of millions of children and had a moral duty to do so and a business case that would really stand up for it. He could do that. And then he would turn and he would say, and you, Fred, I don't like the sales on the ground in Indonesia. I mean, what have you been doing last quarter? You know, he had that ability to move from being a fantastic business person to being more than a business person, to being a committed citizen of the world we all live in, and to thinking very creatively about how he could use business to make a difference. And I think that's the kinds of skills that we need to support in our students.
That's very interesting as well, Rebecca, the idea of moving from me to us, from short term to long term, having a broader vision, but at the same time also at the same time a forward-looking perspective, and also this ability to juggle with two dimensions, the business-like dimension and the probably I would call it societal-like dimension or the likes. It's something interesting because. But this is my own take, by the way. I do think that future leaders have to be able to, again, to juggle different dimensions of society and business. And I do think that it is important to have some kind of, need to be able to address oxymorons. You need to be business-like minded, but at the same time, you need to look at society as well. We are nearly there. I do only have one last question. The last question is from Kuku Anwar, who asks, how can we address the issue of the growing demand of mega cities in response to environmental, social and economic effects? So the question now moves on to the issue of the demography and democracy in large cities.
As I'm sure you know, a majority of the world's population now lives in cities. And I think it's just over 50%, and that's projected to greatly increase. We're going to see many much larger cities. The good news is that it is technologically easier to live sustainably in well-run cities. So if you look at the environmental footprint of people in New York, it's much lower than those in the rest of the country. If you look at a city like Singapore or Copenhagen, the inhabitants have very low footprints because everything's right there, right? So much of the energy we use is transportation and housing. And if you live in a small place and the city is your living room, and you can walk everywhere, your carbon footprint immediately falls dramatically. It's also the case that at their best, cities are nurseries of democracy, places where people talk to each other, where diverse people live side by side and come to understand that more than labels define humans. One of the really interesting findings from the research is that people are much less likely to express negative opinions about people who are different from themselves if they actually have experience with people who are different from themselves. So a city that is genuinely inclusive, which celebrates the diversity of people, can be a much more welcoming place. So cities are potentially the cradle of this new way of working. And more business leaders are recognizing that and reaching out to city leadership to say, what can we do to help? I know a private equity investor who asked every firm in his portfolio to send a letter to the mayor of the city where the firm was located, saying, we want to work with you to address issues of inequality and healthcare and education. We want to build a city in which we are proud to locate, which is good for us to do business in for the long term. And if that hasn't happened in 5 or 10 years, oh, and here's a check. He sent a large check with this letter. And, in 5 or 10 years, if we haven't made progress, we'll consider relocating. So it's a kind of invitation to engagement that I think we'll see from more and more business leaders.
Thanks, Rebecca. I like very much the idea of cities as nurses of democracy. This is very, very, hopeful for us. And of course, I'd like to extend our invitation to you to come to Rome, which is, as you know, is the eternal city. So,
Yes,
and hopefully can be somehow the mother or the grandmother of the nurses that will create a new capitalism and a new democracy. We cannot address any more questions because we have our time has gone, and we need to somehow respect digital times, as we say. There's been a great pleasure. Thanks for sharing your wisdom about reimagining new, capitalism. And I'm pretty sure that our students, our news community, did enjoy this masterclass. Thanks a lot, Rebecca, and look forward to meeting you in person again in Rome or in Boston.
You're very kind. Thank you. And I really look forward to it.
Thank you. Goodbye. Good evening to everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.